Several, they don't all turn up.
Well, good evening and welcome to everyone joining us tonight. We'll leave it just a minute or so while all of you connect in. But thank you for making time to join us for tonight's Society for Church Archaeology lecture. As you know, we'll put on these lectures for free, so you're always welcome to join us each month. However, I know that at least one or two of you may, the rumor has it, not be members of the Society for Church Archaeology. So I would urge that you consider joining us. Not only does it help us put on these evening lectures, but it supports other activities such as our annual conference, our journal, our grants, and that sort of thing. So do please check out our webpage and join the society if you're not a member. If you are a member, well done for being a member. Anyway, it's nice to see lots of names, some which I recognize, and I know that some of you are tuning in from exotic parts of the world, and that's also great to see as well. Just a reminder, while we're waiting for the last people to join in, that if you have questions, and I'm sure you shall, given tonight's topic, which I've had a sneak preview of, just pop them into the chat box, and then Rob will put them to our speakers at the end of the talk. So please do think of challenging, difficult, probing questions, especially if you're in Cornwall, like Paul is. I'm sure there's people further afield than Cornwall as well. So brilliant. I think we will make a start. I will just introduce our two speakers. So tonight we've got another double act, which is always fantastic, but it also means I've got to tell you even more about our speakers, which is great. So tonight we have Professor Harold Mytum, who is a professor probably known to many of you at the University of Liverpool, who's published extensively on funerary archaeology, as well as a range of very diverse other topics, a true polymath there. And he's joined tonight by Anna Fairley, who is a PhD student at the University of Liverpool. Liverpool's kind of theme of the month at the moment, isn't it? Everything seems to be coming either going to or coming from Liverpool. Anyway, but she's researching 19th century monuments and landscapes from Liverpool cemeteries. And tonight's talk, I imagine, is emanating out of work that they've already published on this topic. So if you find things particularly interesting, there was a link, I think Rob put in the Eventbrite sign up to their paper on this topic. So tonight they're going to be talking about investigating the Catholic experience of the 19th century burial crisis, non-invasive archaeology in the crypt and churchyard of St. Patrick's Church, Toxteth, Liverpool. So I think without any further ado, I will hand over to Harold, who's going to start the talk.
Right, thank you very much, Hugh. What we're going to do is I'm going to start off, then Anna's going to do a section, and then I'll come back at the end and do the last part. So you'll hear from both of us, but we decided that we wouldn't make it more linked together than that, because by Zoom it's quite difficult to make it seamless. Yes, we're talking about the work we're doing at St. Patrick's, which we're doing because we were invited in by the congregation and volunteers who are working there to assist with the conservation as they move towards their 200th anniversary of being founded. So we're going to go through the archaeology of the various dimensions of the site that we have been investigating, and moving on beyond what we have published already. So St. Patrick's Church opened in 1827 and served and still serves the Roman Catholic community of Toxteth. But it's on a relatively limited site, as you can see from the aerial photograph there, and had a massive demand for burial space until burial was prohibited in 1854. So this talk reflects on that collaborative project and the various aspects of burial at Toxteth Park. Across the industrialized world, towns and cities grew quickly, and as people congregated together, there were inevitably more deaths. Liverpool was no different, and the dense population, often in very insanitary conditions, led to many epidemics, causing low average life expectancies. Toxteth Park, a developing part of the city in the early 19th century, grew rapidly and housed many Irish Roman Catholic immigrants. It was in this context that St. Patrick's Church, marked by the red dot on the city map, was constructed. And so that's where we're going to be looking. The church was designed by John Slater and was built between 1821 and 1827, a substantial building on a prominent rise with impressive 4-bay west front with wings, which you can see again in the aerial photograph, fronted by Doric Tetra-style porches facing the road. The interior includes a substantial gallery on 3 sides, and the church is surrounded by a small graveyard, but there was also a crypt beneath the church, accessed through massive doors at the west end, which you also see there. The 1849 Ordnance Survey map shows the interior structure of the church. You can see some of the way in which the roofing was laid out and the rooms, including and the burial ground. It also shows some rooms which are now demolished at the east end of the building. We've published the results, as Hugh mentioned, in a journal called Heritage, which you can have the link to through your website, which is also on this slide. But we have been continuing our analysis of our data since then, and there's also been a ground penetrating radar survey for most of the churchyard, which throws more light on burial there, and we're integrating this new information into the talk tonight. The crypt beneath the church was largely cut into the sandstone bedrock. The western end, this was at or below only ground level. Survey is difficult in parts of the crypt, as you might see from some of these pictures, and further cleaning is necessary in places for workers in safety gear to check some of the details for our final plan. Here you can see our preliminary plan. The burial vaults at St. Patrick's, numbered 1 to 4 here, offer an exciting possibility to understand something about middle-class Roman Catholic burial traditions in the first half of the 19th century. This is the first detailed examination of any Roman Catholic burial vaults in Britain that we know of. So if you know of others, do tell us about them, because we want to contextualize this as much as we can within the denomination, as well as comparing it with Anglican ones. Many urban churches dealt with the burial crisis in the late 18th and 19th century by constructing vaults beneath their floors. Archaeologists have managed to study quite a few large communal crypts. The first major published one was at Spitalfields in London, and quite a few family vaults have been investigated in churchyards, some like this in Birmingham, having a series of floors, one above the other, to fill the vault, but there are lots of different designs, and these are all Anglican church sites. So that's some of the background with which we came to St. Patrick's. We also know something about the designs of coffin fittings from ones recovered from all these various investigations, some on the left again from Spitalfields, but also from a few trade catalogues used by undertakers to order fittings for their business. And some of those are rather later than the coffins that we have surviving so far, but others are contemporary. And notice the shield shapes of some of the breastplates that you see on the right-hand image there. We'll see more of things like that as we go through. We're asking, was there a distinctively Catholic style of coffin decoration in Britain? Variation across Europe and North America is partly by denomination, but often more due to cultural preferences, country by country. Here are some Catholic Polish coffins in a vault, with hipped roofed coffins and painted decoration and text. But what did we find in the St. Patrick's vault? So we're going to go through the 4 vaults at St. Patrick's to see what they contain. They were opened up for us to examine the contents, and the entry into Vault 1 you see in the bottom left picture there, which was subsequently bricked up again. Vault 1, coloured red here on the map, was closest to the crypt entrance. It was constructed for some of the priests when they died in office. There were 5 coffins in this vault, though one on the left had collapsed under the weight of the one above. Like most in all vaults, these and Anglican ones, they were triple shelled with a wooden inner coffin, probably cloth lined, but we couldn't check that for certain. This was encased in lead to prevent liquids or smells escaping, and then another layer of wood. These coffins had relatively little evidence of cloth coverings, though there were traces, and they were probably all covered with cloth. Visible was one shield-shaped breastplate, which you can see on the left-hand coffin there, and had the name and details of the deceased, and a rectangular plate, which you can see on the central coffin there. Both are copper alloy, a sort of form of brass, but they're not particularly legible. We know who's buried in these vaults from a number of sources, and you can see there are 4 priests. 3 of them died in an epidemic, and also a Christian brother attached to the church. The other coffin fittings from this vault are simple handles called grips in the trade, and at the top right, a fragment of another breastplate that would have been painted with details, but only this small piece survives as far as we can tell from how we can access. We weren't able to move the coffins or anything, so access to all parts of the burial vault so it's somewhat limited. It's of stamped iron, and that was a cheaper form of coffin fitting. None of the fittings, such as the grips, can be linked to particular clerics or coffins because they were all lying on the floor, and they'd probably come off when the textiles had decayed. Vault 2 belonged to the Marsh family, but we only have one certain name. Some of the others are in the burial register with the grave location given as vault. So they're probably also here. Thomas Marsh was a timber merchant in the city. These coffins are again all triple shell and all were cloth covered. The condition of the coffins varies considerably, with the one at the top right in a much better condition, and the black cloth covering is obvious. Whereas for the others, they have severely decayed. You might be able to see bits of textile just sort of hanging off the coffins. The breastplates are again of the stamped iron variety. The one on the left, similar in form to the fragment in Vault 1, and the other is a shield form. The texts would have been painted onto these breastplates, but nothing could be discerned in the vault conditions. If we'd been able to take these into a lab, perhaps that would have been a different story. The same pattern of different survival is even more obvious in Vault 3. Here there are only 3 coffins present, 2 certainly, and one probably a Berry family member. The one on the left for Thomas Berry, who was a hide merchant, is in excellent condition, but the others have clearly deteriorated far more. And we think that the wooden frames on the right there and in some of the other vaults are later additions. And I think we all think that the coffins may have been moved about during the time of the vault's use and subsequently. And so their original positions are not necessarily guaranteed. The breastplates in this vault are copper alloy shield shapes. Where we've done tests, they're actually brass, all with incised text. We've done tests with portable XRF. 2 are readable, but the one at the top right cannot be transcribed, even though we can see it as writing on it, but it's between the 2 coffins and on the wooden rack, and we couldn't read it. All, however, have an IHS with cross at the top, which you may be able to just about make out on the one on the left. We'll see some more in a minute, a characteristic Roman Catholic symbol. Vault 4 is the most complex vault, constructed for Peter Reynolds, a sailmaker. All of the vaults had this style of barrel vault. I've only shown it on this one picture, but for this vault alone, there is a lower area below the floor level of all the others. Beneath those stone slabs you can see with the iron rings on. The Roberts family obviously intended to use this vault for some time, and apparently the lower space does contain 1 adult and 1 child coffin, though we have not examined them. This is the only vault with infant coffins, which you can see in the middle between the 2 adult coffins, which you can also notice are not orientated the same direction. The coffins in this vault have been moved about more than in the others, in part because access is easier, because there is a cast iron door. So that vault contains more people and even more below ground that we couldn't see. This vault has 2 shield-shaped brass breastplates, with the one for Peter Roberts on his coffin, but the other to Richard Roberts, which is out of place. The registers state that Richard was buried in grave H2, which would be in the churchyard, not in the vault. So it's possible this was recovered when his body was exhumed from a pit, which we'll discuss later, and the plate put in the family vault at that point. Or he wasn't really buried in H2, and he's now was buried in this vault, but his coffin has collapsed. We know from old photographs that how the coffins are arranged now, this is the only one for which we have an old photograph of the interior, they were arranged in a completely different way. This vault also has some unusual coffin fittings, and ones that may well be those selected more often by Catholics. There's a wooden ringed cross that you can see on the left with gold paint for Teresa Elizabeth Roberts, and 2 small crosses on the infant coffins. 1 cross in wood with no text visible on the right, and a small copper alloy cross to Odysseus Roberts. What a wonderful name, although he didn't have much time to appreciate it, though no Roberts is in the register for the relevant year, which it says on that cross of 1833. There is also the unusual painted coffin for Mary Roberts, which you can see bottom left. Both Mary and Teresa have their texts in fine Gothic script, and Mary has all the numbers, year, age, and so on in Roman numerals. This is a fine survival with across the whole length of the coffin lid, and doesn't need any metal fittings at all. So it's quite a different style. Those are the above ground vaults. They're within the crypt, but you access them from the floor of the crypt. But there seems to be at least one lower sunk in the ground communal vault, which may contain many other people named in the registers as being in a vault, but not the ones we've investigated. We saw at the beginning how communal vaults could have stacked coffins in Anglican contexts, and this one is probably the same. We've not opened the coffins as this is a non-intrusive study, but we've managed to discover a surprising amount, summarised on this slide. Some middle-class families had vault in the crypt, but not many, reflecting the general poverty in Toxteth at this time. Each vault was built separately. They're not part of the initial architect's concept, and indeed access to each vault has a slightly different shaped and positioned way in. Some priests were interred in a crypt vault, but didn't have fancy coffins, though they were triple shelled, as were all the adult coffins where we could see. This might have been a rule. People were worried about infection through miasmas, fumes coming up from the burials into the church above. Lay people's coffins are, again, not that elaborate compared with many in Anglican vaults, without the use of upholstery pins to hold on the fabric, which must have been glued in place instead, and with simple grips and grip plates, making the coffins quite plain. There is, though, a greater use of the cross than on Anglican coffins, as we saw mainly in the Roberts vault, and the use of the IHS with cross motif on the breastplates. The survival of the paint in the Roberts vault is a notable feature and mirrors internal brass Gothic Revival monuments, though none are at St. Patrick's, with enamelled colouring lettering. So it's almost as if there's an aesthetic there, which we see in other aspects of church archaeology. So enough of the vaults. What about the memorials? And Anna takes over here. Okay, Anna, are you with us?
Yes, I am. So when we first arrived, the only exterior memorials we could see was this line of ledges on the left on the aerial photograph, and two larger monuments on the bottom of the picture. Although we guessed that there were maybe more that had been buried under the grass, partly because we know that these ledges were the most popular style of memorial at the time. And when probing the grass, we could feel more stone to the right of that line there. A writer in the Albion newspaper in 1827, which is the year St. Patrick's opened, complained that the parish cemeteries are merely flagged with flat gravestones, like a common yard, scarcely an upright tomb or enclosed emblem of affection remembrance is to be seen. You got the next one, Harold? Thank you. So soon the church volunteers had exposed more gravestones beneath the turf, some buried up to 6 stones deep. So this shows at some point that they'd been moved from their original locations and probably paved the whole of the northwestern corner of the churchyard, which fits with the quote previously and also with what can be seen in the aerial photo of the church. There's also a few memorials inside the crypt, 2 plaques on the wall commemorating the priests and the Christian brother, which, as we've seen, were in Vault 1, as well as 3 more ledges and 3 headstones that have presumably been moved at some point from outside. Another stone, the one on the right here with the hole in it, was found in one of the pits inside the crypt, which had previously been mounted on the wall where the hole is with the fixing. And it's now been restored by one of the volunteers and is displayed within the church. As you can see here, survival of the memorials varies. They're excellent condition in the crypt, as are those that were buried, such as the one on the right. But the exposed ledges have suffered from weathering. Although we only have a small sample so far, there were 19 external memorials with legible inscriptions, and then there are 8 more in the crypt. We still have enough to consider the type of monuments that were being erected, what they were made of, and the types of text and motifs carved on them. Although the majority of the memorials would have been the flat ledges, it's interesting that we have a few varieties of headstones as well. The headstone for Thomas Maguire, who died in 1846, has a horizontal top, but has incised a more elaborate shape with the IHS and cross set within the top of the design. That's the one on the top. This shape forms the headstone profile for John Rooney, who died in 1841, and Mary Moran, the stone in the picture on the bottom, who died in 1844, and is a shape found across Northeast Ireland used by both Catholic and Protestant communities. So the stones are an interesting example of early Roman Catholic memorials in an urban English context. Catholicism is demonstrated in two main ways, in their inscription and their decoration. The IHS abbreviation, which is a contraction of the Greek word for Jesus, was consistently used with a cross attached to the bar of the H, here shown in all those examples. Although the IHS becomes popular on later Anglican monuments, the additional cross is uniquely a Catholic symbol. Many forms of this can be found across Ireland. And another aspect demonstrating Catholicism is the use of requiescat in pace for one person, and requiescat in pace for more than one person, or just the English equivalent rest in peace. Occasionally there's an exhortation to pray for the soul of the deceased, but this wasn't as common as might have been expected. In 1854, an order of council closed most of the churchyards in the city, including St. Patrick's. 1856, land was purchased in Ford, north of the city, for the Roman Catholic Church congregations of the city of Liverpool. It's here that many of the congregation of St. Patrick's would have then gone on to bury their dead, although another cemetery, Anfield Cemetery, also opened in 1863 with a section reserved for Catholics. My research has shown that some of the similarities and differences in the memorials with St. Patrick's, the requiescat in pace and the prayers for the dead remain common, unlike the Anglican and nonconformist sections. The ledger stones, however, weren't allowed at Ford Cemetery or at Anfield, and headstones become the most popular shape of monument. Many of these have a cross built into the top, like the two shown here, but note that these are without the cross on the IHS symbolism in the center. There also seem to be new ways to express Irish identity that we didn't see so far at St. Patrick's. There are many memorials made of Irish limestone, though this is the same material as the large cross that commemorates the priests at the front of St. Patrick's Church is made of. Some memorials have the names of Irish masons inscribed on them, showing that it wasn't just the masons here that were importing the material due to demand, but people were ordering complete monuments from masons in Ireland. Many of the more standard sandstone headstones, similar to those found in the other cemeteries and denominations in Liverpool, feature shamrocks to the extent that they're the most common motif after the IHS with cross symbolism. The use of the shamrock occurs occasionally in Ireland in the later 19th century, but it's far more common amongst Irish communities abroad, as we see in Liverpool, but also here shown in Australia. And it's also popular as a motif in North America. This is a change compared with the St. Patrick's monuments, which show Roman Catholic symbols, but not specifically Irish motifs. We're still considering how and why this design shift took place, but we've already learned a lot more than just the names and the dates from the memorials that we have. Despite the small sample of memorials, clear patterns can be discerned, though we cannot consider spatial arrangements because most of them have been moved. Many more may yet lie beneath the grass, and we're discussing how we could investigate them. A man called Gibson transcribed a selection of the graveyard memorial inscriptions in the city in the 19th century and noted 28 at St. Patrick's, and we don't know if that's all that there were or if there are more to be found. Priests were commemorated, but most memorials were for lay families. As with elsewhere in the city churchyards, ledgers were popular, but there were distinctive Irish shapes for headstones, and the IHS with the cross, requiescat in pace, and the prayers for the dead are all characteristic Roman Catholic features. Lots of publications across the country about graveyards running out of room for burials appeared from the late 18th century, and horror stories about corpses accidentally being dug up soon after interment. This graph shows the Liverpool deaths in the decade before St. Patrick's opened. As early as 1784, Dr. Moss, in an article called A Familiar Medical Survey of Liverpool, wrote that burying the dead in churchyards in the heart of large towns has been universally disapproved of by the most eminent and learned of the medical faculty, and was likely to occasion diseases from the daily custom of opening graves too early, and health, humanity, decency cry aloud against such barbarities. And the situation was no different in these decades following and around the opening of St. Patrick's Church. And back to Harold.
Thank you. Yes, for some reason I can't use my arrows on my computer to move on to the next slide, so that's why I'm having to do it with a little click, extra click. So when St. Patrick's Churchyard opened in 1827, would this ease pressure in the city or only become another location with overcrowding? It seems that the way in which burial at St. Patrick's was managed was by using rock-cut pits. These were not great, there was not a great depth of soil, so the type of burial normally seen in older graveyards where you're digging and redigging within a deep soil is not possible. The gravestones and ledgers may have been placed over family graves, but most of the churchyard was devoted to communal pits, and some of them we've got marked here where we have surveyed them or estimate that they are. Sorry. The opening of the churchyard of St. Patrick's was important for the Catholic population of Toxteth Park and Liverpool as a whole. As before then, Catholics could only be buried either at St. Nicholas Church, the small number shown in this chart in orange, the colour above the blue and below the yellow, or in parish churchyards and cemeteries without any Catholic service. You can see how popular St. Patrick's is, that's the yellow bars, almost straight away. The yellow disappears as the later burial registers have been lost. So you can imagine how the total number of the Catholics buried in Liverpool was actually much larger. And you can see that line sort of shows how enormous the number, probably off the top of this scale, would have been the total number of burials by a year. This chart shows the burials at St. Patrick's in more detail until the part of 1841 when it's missing from then onwards. So because we don't have a complete picture of what was happening, we have to do some inferences for the total population. But you can see the sorts of numbers in the first few years. And it's unlikely these numbers would have been decreasing in the years up to when it was forced to close in 1854. It's especially unfortunate that we don't get a definitive sense of the impact of the Irish famine and subsequent devastating epidemics, but using the burial registers from contemporary churchyards, we can confidently assume that the number of burials continuously rose with a peak in 1847 and a rough number of 15,000 total burials, which doesn't seem an unrealistic estimate. So although the burial registers survived for only some of the years at St. Patrick's, they give an idea of the numbers having to be buried. Most years there were over 10 burials a week, and sometimes quite a few in one day. For example, 4 people were buried in grave AA 42 on the 10th of August 1833. And you can see all these from AA 42. And they're from May and August, so there seems to be 2 little batches of activity for AA 42. These graves, with many people in them, were presumably the rock-cut pits in the churchyard. Many of them are not filled all in one go, probably so that decay processes could start in these open grave pits before more were added. The people listed here were all put together. There's 30 listed here, 15 adults and 15 children. Sadly, we do not have a plan of the numbered and lettered grave plots, so we do not know where grave AA 42 was located in the churchyard, but graves AA 40, AA 41 and AA 43 were also intensively used in 1833. This histogram on the next slide of recorded burials shows the age structure of those dying. And you can have the youngest at the bottom and then the oldest at the top. If you survived till you were 3, you probably could reach at least till your 20s, but you can see how few reached their 60s. This is from about total of about 7,500 people. The numbers dying in infancy was truly appalling. This has an implication for burial space. Most of the coffins would have been small, so more could be fitted in each pit. Other documentary evidence also helps us understand how people were being buried at St. Patrick's. A report by the newly appointed Medical Officer of Health stated that St. Patrick's was one of 7 Liverpool burial grounds where pits were used. He stated that they varied in depth from 18 to 30 feet, were 7 to 12 feet long, and 3.5 to 9 feet wide. The number of burials in each pit at St. Patrick's were up to 120. The churchyard plan shows pits we could identify from the surface traces, with some of the pits used for plant beds in the present. You can see those on the top left. Others could be seen in the summer and the bottom right. Some of them can be seen in summer with colour changes in the grass, which is what you might see slight traces of in the top left, or by areas of subsidence in the tarmac area in the southern part of the churchyard. This used to be wasn't tarmacked until relatively recently, and you can see these pit-shaped patches where the ground has been subsided and more tarmac has been put down. The recent ground penetrating radar survey reveals that there were burial in all areas, and some of these may well be more large pits. The interpretive plot, which you see the large picture on the left, shows how many substantial disturbances were noted, which are all the red hashed bits. Though their irregular shapes reflect their probably mixed fills, an issue we'll return to later. The lack of evidence in the northwest, where Anna was talking about the grave slab, is probably because of all those buried ledges where the family graves were located, which would have impeded the effectiveness of the GPR to go deeper. The cross sections, which you see an example of on the bottom right, show pits or shafts with minimal space between some of them. We can estimate at least 15,000 interments by the time burial stopped in 1854. So you can see in only 1828 to 1854, this is the number of burials. This tells us something about the social conditions in Toxteth at this time, but also allows us to think about the burial pit usage, remembering that the coffins of many infants and small children would take up less. And you can see our estimates there of the different numbers that we think of the total population would be there. The Catholic mission of St Mary and St Michael Tower Hamlets, London, was excavated between 2003 and 2010. And the archaeologists found earth-dug trenches 4 meters deep with coffins stacked in them, with adults at the bottom, adolescents in the middle, and infants at the top. So that may have been a way in which these pits were filled. The 30 possible external pits identified at St Patrick's, and possibly more on the GPR, may have been filled in this way. If each could take the documented 120, that would count for about 3,600, which would take only 7 years of burial to fill. The other areas of the churchyard will have had a lower density of burials, as part of the graves of them were graves reserved for particular families, hence memorials. But this might extend, and the few extra pits that we have found on the GPR might extend the time before reuse to 10 years. So the question is, what would happen then when all the pits were full? The site is very constrained and there's no room for any extension. As in the case in many countries, and must have been common in urban Victorian Britain, but not recorded, areas of churchyard must have been cleared of charnel for reuse. It's therefore possible the crypt pits, we go back to the plan of the interior here, and these are marked with varying degrees of uncertainty. We can see there's a pit, but not the exact dimensions, and some of these blank areas may yet have more pits in them. We just need to do more clearance. If you remember, we said that we had sort of health and safety issues being able to examine every bit of the floor. These pits were for charnel, with each internal pit able to contain the skeletons from at least 4 external pits, about 500 individuals. That's with removing all any coffin debris and so on. If the internal pits had been used for coffin burial, we know from the vaults that these coffins would not have decayed quickly, so reuse would have been very difficult. If the church managed an efficient burial management with their lettered and numbered external pits, and then removed any coffin wood and fittings during exhumation and repacked the charnel within the church, they would free up the external pits for another round of burial. So the pits are well organized in the interior inside the crypt, and you can see they're laid out between parallel walls which hold the floor of the church above. Access to these pits could be managed with movable wooden partitions, as indicated. Can you see in these in the slots? We've got actually put one in there to show. We could put wooden barriers can go across these walls to prevent people falling in these pits, and to indicate which ones the charnel needs to go next. So that's how we think that it was managed inside the church. We also know that some, and possibly all of the pits, were emptied at some point, as volunteer investigations have found 20th century refuse in the fills, and no human remains at all. The debris contains everything from parts of the original altar rail, which was replaced in the 1950s, hymn and service books, sheets of church music, cigarette packets, and a variety of ecclesiastical and more general debris, including even a hat and a shoe. We intend to establish a protocol for the clearance of another shaft to record more consistently what was thrown away into them, but the main point is that the human remains have gone. It's likely that these were cleared when the Ford Roman Catholic Cemetery opened, as there was a parish priest at the time known for his enthusiasm for the clearance of burials, and they could have all been taken up to a communal ossuary at Ford. Whether the external pits were also emptied is uncertain, but it would explain the radar irregular shapes if they were also filled with mixed refuse. By the time this 1890 Ordnance Survey map of Liverpool was drawn up, the churchyard had not been used for some time, and the parts that had pits were laid out as gardens. Only the area in the northwest, where the ledgers and other memorials were in place, was still labelled as a burial ground. The rest had flower beds and some shrubs or small trees. The hectic burial management phase was now over. The church was a place for religious services, including funerals, but body management was now transferred out to Ford and Anfield cemeteries. Only through our research have the different strategies for burial and commemoration at St. Patrick's been revealed, and we can now model how the efficient body management systems enabled 15,000 individuals to be interred over a period of around 35 years in a very limited space. Resting in peace was only the luxury of the richer parishioners, but at least all could be interred in a timely manner, even if the communal pit burials were not as respectable and permanent as could then be achieved in the cemeteries which followed. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Harold and Anna. That's really, really fascinating. There's an awful lot of food for thought there, actually. So while Rob's collating some questions, I'm going to ask at least one or two, I think. I think that's really fascinating, the level of graveyard management that's going on. And you've got the great archaeological evidence for it. And I think that's unique as far as I know anyway. But it just strikes me that the documentary sources seem to be completely silent about what must be a completely industrial, well, not industrial process of clearance, but I mean, very, very organized and potentially mass clearance taking place. I mean, are there any hints that, you know, the clearing of those pits, are there any records? I'm not suggesting photographs, but anything that would add further light to that? Or
well, I'll start off. Anna might want to add something. The first thing is that the Roman Catholic Church's records are not as extensive as the Anglican Church. So not only do we not have the registers, but there's a lot of other documentation that for an Anglican church, you know, you'd have church wardens meetings and all sorts of other documentation, better accounts, all sorts of things. And that we don't have, and you'd expect people being paid to move all these, the charnel and so on. So there's, unfortunately, we don't get anything like that. But I think it must have been just an unwritten statement, because the same is true, of course, of the Anglican Church. How on earth did they really manage to pack all the people in? I mean, all of us who live in or visit cities and see the size of the churchyards, if you go and look at the registers of how many people are being placed in them year after year after year after year, then it clearly must have been very highly managed. And although there's lots of complaints, there must have been even to even get to the point of being able to fit more and more people in, leading to the complaints, must have been a major undertaking. And I don't see how you can do it without somehow extracting a lot of the bone and putting it to one side. So I do wonder whether there was other management strategies elsewhere that may not have been like this, because of course most churches don't have sort of a set of pits inside to put the bones in. But I just don't know what happened. But I can't believe that there weren't other management strategies. Don't know whether Anna wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, for the cemeteries too, I haven't come across anything in the minutes or records they were making themselves. And there's so few newspaper articles that, as Harold says, it was maybe just accepted or done so secretly. The only uproar I saw was one of the earliest cemetery in Liverpool. They at one stage, I think during the 1870s, were selling graves and then turfing people out of them quite soon, seeing as they were supposed to be for forever graves, and then charging to bury again. So that was an uproar for charnel, but in the economic way rather than anything else. So it's really hard to tell.
No, I think that's. I mean, I guess what struck me is that the clearing of the external pits, I can fully understand, and that makes perfect sense. But actually, then clearing the internal ones and not reusing them just seemed to me kind of almost go a step too far. Well, not a step too far, but you know, there's obviously something going on there, and I think that's really, really fascinating. And it'd be really.
I think they're being cleared after burial is being banned, and the cleric was obsessed with clearing bodies away, and we think he organized the removal of all the charnel as well as bodies. I mean, no one was really bothered about the charnel, but clearly he had an obsession about it, and I think that's when they all were removed probably to Ford Cemetery, and probably placed in a huge communal pit there. The records, again, Anna knows far more than me, but the records for Ford Cemetery are not the best either.
No,
so we don't have a record of, you know, of such or a map that shows such a pit, but it's likely that there and possibly some of the other Catholic churches in the city were also similarly cleared up to the cemetery, which is where, after all the relatives would be going for all their later, you know, grave visiting.
No, I think that's fascinating. Rob, do we have any questions that aren't me?
We do, yeah. We've got some questions. We've got one from John here. It's going back, Harold, to the chart on the numbers of deaths per year. Is there a chart of deaths per capita instead over this time period? That has now jumped up, and I've missed the end of the question. It says it would be interesting to see if there is a trend. Sorry, the chat box scrolled up and I missed the question.
Yeah, that's quite difficult to work out because it's a bit difficult to know who is being drawn into the Toxteth St Patrick's congregation, so to speak, and burial. Not everybody who lives immediately adjacent might still have been going, if they're Catholic, to this particular church and wishing to be buried there. So that's one problem. The other is, of course, the overall population figures are total. They're not broken down by religion. So with things like the Irish arriving after the famine and so on, then the proportion of Catholics might increase over time and then perhaps decrease again as people moved on or whatever. So I think it's quite difficult to actually have a comparison. You might be able to do it for the city as a whole in terms of burials and population, but in the end, the total population ends up being dead and has to end up being buried. So they're all going in there, or some equivalent place some point. But of course, the cemeteries, as Anna's researching, start earlier in Liverpool than many places, but the earliest ones don't allow any Catholics in. So that's why the pressure is particularly high on the Catholics in terms of finding parochial burial spaces.
Yeah, I have calculated the percentage of all burials in Liverpool for the Catholic churches I've combined together, and in the 1830s it seems to be about 10% rising to 20% in the early 1840s, but that would be also including the other churches that were included on that graph, although most of them were St Patrick's to begin with. So
that's great, thank you. I hope that answers your question. John, another question is, was there a process for physically placing the coffins into these pits? Do we know anything about how that was done?
No, because we haven't done any excavation. But Anna has shared with me an image of how Anfield Cemetery stacked up adults and children in a grave. They had a sort of schematic drawing, which is not surprising how it looks. You pack several infant ones on top of one adult one. So we don't know, but I would suspect that they are pretty well packed in. I think that probably, for example, in that pit example we saw, the gap between the May and the August was to give a time for a bit of decay to go on before the next lot go in, to try and get things moving before you fill the pit up and leave it to do its stuff for 7 or 10 years or however long you've got. It may be they were adding things in to try and increase the speed of decomposition. But if you're getting, up to 4 a day, 10 a week in a pit, the pit is undoubtedly staying open all this time, which we know from other Anglican churchyards and cemeteries with big grave trenches. That's how they did it. That's how the body snatchers were able to go in and get the poor people's bodies quite easily, because they didn't have to move any soil. And we have that in Liverpool. Anna's been doing some work on the body snatching in the city. So some might have disappeared in that way, of course, but not a large number. So I think they would have been filling them up, and then only the very top would have been covered with some soil. But they would want to pack in as many as they could.
Yeah. I suppose that leads very well into our final question, which is a question about the fear of being dug up and resurrectionists. So someone has asked, is there any evidence for fear of being dug up? And cites an example where it leads with these lock-up graves and other evidence in the north of England.
Well, they could just get out, of course. they could just break their way out of their coffin and walk out of the pit. So that unless they're the first in the pit, in which case it would be rather deep, they'd have to just shout out for some help. So because they're not being covered by 6 foot of soil, then I don't think there's any problem about people getting out of the coffins. I should think that would have created a stir and would have been in the papers, though, if people have been climbing out of these burial pits right by the road.
I haven't come across any. It's an interesting question because it was definitely a fear in Liverpool at the time, and it was a founded fear because there's evidence that there's newspaper articles, especially in the parish cemetery, where again it was as overcrowded as St. Patrick's, that they were finding barrels of salted or pickled bodies on the dock ready to be shipped up to Scotland for use in the medical schools, because before the Anatomy Act, you know, they were so short on corpses. So the fact that we know it was happening, perhaps at St. Patrick's, I mean, it would have been very easy, one could imagine, with the open pits in the churchyard. That would make you think that the people with more money would be paying to have some sort of morte-safe or something over their grave, but I haven't come across any evidence of that so far, except I guess for being buried in a vault underground with a bricked up entrance or a big iron door is something.
But it's not any good if you wake up in your coffin. So you know, you have to, if you've been morte-safed in to stop the body snatchers, then you're stymied when you try and escape. So if you wake up, but I think the fear of being buried alive was less than the fear of being dug up dead, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for your questions as well. I'll hand back to Hugh.
Well, just a final observation. It strikes me that if there is a local fear for people being dug up by resurrectionists and whatever, that might explain why you have such a predominance of flat memorials, rather than, you know, because it'd be much harder to get to the people below. But anyway, fascinating. We could go on. We need another talk on this particular topic. So anyway, well, thank you very much. I'm afraid the clock has beaten us. Before I say a final thanks to our speakers, I will just let you know that we have another lecture lined up for next month for the 6th of June. And we have Michael Shapland talking to us about Selsey Cathedral or Abbey and the early medieval kingdom of Sussex. So different part of the country, different time period, but I'm sure will be equally fascinating. So it just remains for me to say thank you to our 2 speakers, Harold and Anna, for a fascinating talk. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope as many of you can come back and see you again next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.